My point in the first lecture for this week was to try to stress that by the 1820s, most Americans are comfortable, that was the word I used. They accept, they agree to the division of the United States along the line that I've described several times into slave and non-slave states. And that everybody's sort of happy with it, it works. And most Americans don't even consider it. People in the North don't have slavery, but they don't really object to it. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, there are people in the North who benefit from slavery. Some large bankers made lots of money from their investments in Southern assets. Most people just accept it, and most people in the South also accept it as something that's there, and it's just part of their life. There are people who did not like slavery, and there were some. They're a very small minority, but the only thing that they can think of to do about slavery, they can't really get to the heart of it because they can't overcome, even the people who didn't like slavery, they couldn't overcome their racism or their acceptance of slaves as property. So the people who did object to slavery, and there's not very many of them, but it's people like who joined the American Anti-Slavery Society, and what they were doing was to try to raise money, and from themselves or however, and use the money as private citizens to buy slaves and relocate them to Africa, where they established the country of Liberia, which exists to this day. So that's the way things were up through the 1820s. In 1831, by coincidence, two very, very significant events took place. Two changing events that altered the situation totally and forever, significantly. These two events, one was in the North, one was in the South. Let's take the one in the South first. In August of 1831, a slave named Nat Turner, somewhere in Virginia, Nat Turner led a rebellion against slaves. Now, I talked before about slave resistance to slavery, and I talked about the whole concept of putting on old massa. And at that time I mentioned something about Nat Turner. Nat Turner was, as I told you, one of the house slaves. He is within the slave community. There were hierarchies of slaves, and the most significant, the highest ranked slaves were those who actually worked inside the master's house, whether they worked as butlers, maids, cooks, cleaning people, whatever. They were right in the house. In many cases, they lived in the master's house. They had quarters there. And those were considered the elite of slaves. And slave owners would take into their houses the slaves whom they regarded as the most trustworthy, the most intelligent, that they thought they were intelligent. And generally they accorded them special privileges that the typical field hand did not get. And Nat Turner was one of those elite slaves. He knew how to read and write. It was against the law in the South to teach a slave to read or write. But Nat Turner somehow had learned to read. I think we may know how. It doesn't occur to me right now how Nat Turner had learned to read and write, but he was familiar with the Bible, and he had read the Bible, and he was very thoroughly familiar with biblical injunctions against slavery. So he and a band of followers went rounding through the area of the countryside. This was in the southern part of Virginia, just over the line, the state line from North Carolina. And they started killing white people. Eventually they were tracked down. Eventually they were sentenced and executed. Before his execution, as he was in the prison waiting the day of his death, Nat Turner wrote a memoir which has been published and is well available to you today, called The Confessions of Nat Turner. And in that he explained why he had done what he had done, and explained how he was acting within the context of Christianity. Well, Nat Turner's rebellion terrified the South. There had been many other slave revolts. There had been other instances of runaway slaves. There had been always resistance to slavery. Slavery had never been totally accepted by the slaves. Some of the resistance was very low key. I think I talked about myself as an example. If I had been a slave, I would have resisted, but I would have done it. To be honest, I have to confess, I'm not a particularly brave or strong person, and my resistance would have been very low key, trying to figure out ways to play, putting on old massa, figure out games to play with my master, so that I could show, well, I'm going to do what you say, and I'm going to play the game your way, but I'm going to have my own little private rules that I'm going to make up, and I'm going to do what I want, because I'm a human being. But my resistance would have been very low-key. Much of slave resistance was low-key. The most extreme form, of course, was an outright slave rebellion, such as Nat Turner's, where white people were killed. And what frightened the South the most about this, there had been other rebellions. Not very many, but there had been rebellions. Your book mentions a couple of them. But what was so frightening was that Nat Turner was one of our trusted slaves. He was one of the slaves that white people had brought into his house, into their home, shared their living facilities with this slave because they trusted him. They regarded him as the elite of the slave class. He's not one of the hard-working field slaves who might be rebellious in other ways. He was one of the insiders. And from that time on, the South became more and more paranoid about defending slavery. They looked at every possible event that might be a sign of resistance as a serious life-threatening event. They began shutting down all kinds of activity by slaves. The southern local governments adopted more and more rules regulating the movement of slaves, requiring slaves to have passes. Southern governments spent enormous amounts of money on local government on maintaining watches along the roads and throughout the counties and so forth, supervising slaves. They became just very defensive of slavery. And whereas before they had just sort of, the general thrust of the Southern discussion of slavery had been that, well, it's just something that we have, and it works, and we brought these slaves here from Africa, and we're providing them with a better life than they would have in Africa, and it's just a part of our economic system. But after 1831, more and more as time goes on, Southerners defended slavery as a positive good, as something that was really beneficial to the slaves and to the white people, that this was God's way. There's a whole body of Christian literature defending slavery as biblically endorsed as part of Christ's way for us. So the South became just obsessed with this defense of slavery that as time went on became more and more intense. It just became more and more embedded in the country, in the South, that slavery was an absolute necessity. Up until 1831, there had been even many anti-slavery people in the South. Many, actually more anti-Southern, more anti-slave people were in the South than in the North, because slavery was in the South. So more people who were opposed to slavery were in the South. Especially this was true of many small farmers in the South, who argued that economically slavery was hurting them. They argued that by having to compete against slave labor, the slave labor was producing agricultural products that lowered the price and hurting the income of small farmers. One of the prominent examples of that, it's only one example of this, was in the western part of Virginia, the western areas of Virginia, many of which are actually west of the Appalachians. Now, Virginia, of course, as you remember, had been where slavery got started. Virginia had been the tobacco country. Tobacco was a very labor-intensive crop, and so very early on in the history of Virginia, slavery became a part of the state's laws. And there were big tobacco plantations in Virginia, many of which traced their ancestry back to colonial days, back to the very first days when John Rolfe had introduced tobacco to Virginia, and people who lived in Virginia as of 1612 and owned land became big tobacco farmers. And of course, they're all right in the very eastern coastal areas around Chesapeake Bay. So in those areas, even by the 1820s, 1830s, that's still tobacco country, that's still slave country. But it's not cotton country. And as such, it was not an area where the demand for slavery was increasing. As a matter of fact, in Virginia, by the 1810s, 1820s, more and more of the tobacco is being grown outside of the coastal region, where there are these old-time, big-time tobacco plantations. Instead, more and more of the tobacco is being grown by small farmers, family farmers, typical American family farmers, living in western parts of the state and raising tobacco, yes, but as family farmers. And some of those farmers began to argue that, wait a minute, slavery in the eastern part of the state is hurting us. Slavery enables those big plantation owners to grow tobacco at very low prices. That undercuts the price of tobacco for all of us, and it reduces our income. If we got rid of slavery, if we got rid of those big plantations, the price of tobacco would go up and our income would go up. So there's actually a fairly strong anti-slavery element within the western parts of Virginia. Virginia politics were largely eastern part versus western. The eastern was dominated by the big plantation owners, some of whose ancestors have been there for centuries, back to the days of John Rolfe. And then the western part, the newer areas of Virginia that are just being settled, the areas west of the Appalachians, which are now being settled, but where the more traditional small family farm is the norm, and many of those small family farmers were anti-slavery. But Nat Turner's revolt put an end to anti-slavery sentiment in the South. There was a time, starting around 1829, when Virginia reconsidered its state constitution, and there was considerable sentiment in Virginia, the motherhood of slavery, if you will. There was considerable sentiment in Virginia itself to abolish slavery. It came from the western parts of the state. It came from small farmers who were revolting against, objecting to the dominance of the state by the eastern plantation owners. There was a state constitutional convention to draft a new constitution for the state of Virginia that would have abolished slavery in Virginia. And at that convention, the debates got pretty intense, with a large sentiment opposed to slavery. And then came Nat Turner's revolt, and the anti-slavery people in Virginia lost. They kind of had to give up. They couldn't accept, they couldn't offset the great support for slavery that Nat Turner's revolt started off. The pro-slavery people could come in and say, look, we can't abolish slavery. If we abolish slavery, we'll all be killed as were the people who Nat Turner had killed. And so the movement to abolish slavery in Virginia failed. The small farmers lost, and even many of them had to kind of grudgingly accept, well, yeah, we better accept slavery. We can't expose ourselves to the possibility of a new Nat Turner coming out and killing us. So that's just one example of how any kind of anti-slavery sentiment in the South just got crushed. Nobody could be anti-slavery in the South after Nat Turner, or slowly the whole anti-slavery sentiment in the South, to the extent that it had been there, it disappeared, and the South became more and more committed to slavery, and it became more and more of an intensification of fear of letting slavery go.